Go. Okay. Welcome. It is my great pleasure to introduce you all to Matt Slocombe, who of course you know, because he is one of the people who has been hosting this CEN seminar series for a while now. And Matt is also a researcher with the Developmental Neurocognition Lab, as well as working with the Center for Educational Neuroscience. And he works mainly on sort of how children learn with analogies from both a basic and an applied perspective. He's been working with Professor Michael Thomas and with Professor Andy Tolmie as well. And today he's going to talk to us about the role of analogy in building knowledge, transfer, categories, and classroom practice. Thank you so much, Matt.
Thanks, Natasha, and thanks everybody for coming along. Yeah, so as Natasha said, today I'm going to be talking about how children learn using analogies from two different perspectives. So one perspective is thinking about how analogies work in the mind, so the kind of cognitive processes that are involved in forming analogies and learning with analogies. And the other perspective is thinking about how this can be used in the classroom. So this is predominantly a talk for teachers, and what I kind of want to do here is provide a bit of a theoretical framework that can be used in lots of different contexts in teaching. So I'd be very interested to hear from teachers at the end of the talk if they've got any comments at all. So so this is the roadmap of the talk. So first of all, I'm going to talk a bit about what analogy is, and a few points about knowledge as well that will help us understand how analogy is implicated in building knowledge. And then I'm going to talk about two different ways that analogy is implicated in learning. And one of those is in forming categories, and the other is transferring information between categories. And at the end, I'm going to talk about why children can find analogies difficult sometimes, and different strategies that we can use to support children when they're learning with this process. So what do we mean by analogy? Well, analogy is a particular kind of similarity. It's called, you can define analogy as relational similarity. So the one thing the brain's really good at is grouping stuff together because there's something similar, whether it's perceptual features or organization. So we can understand that this dog and this coat is the same because they're perceptually similar, they share the same color. We can understand that the moon is perceptually similar to a basketball because it shares the same form. Although when we're talking about analogy, we're talking about relational similarity. So if you look at this image on the left-hand side, we can understand that these three ceramic vessels are similar to these three people on the right-hand side. And that's not because they share the same perceptual features as in the other examples. It's because the relationships between objects are shared across both examples. So on the left, in both examples, the largest thing is on the left-hand side, and the smallest is on the right-hand side, and the medium-sized thing is in the middle. So it's the relationships between the ceramic vessels and the people that's the same, rather than any perceptual features. And that's the essence of analogy, what we mean by analogy. So that's an example of a spatial analogy. And we can do this with concepts as well. So on the left-hand side, there's a bird feeding an insect to its chick. And on the right-hand side, there's a human adult feeding their baby some baby food. And again, these are, we can understand these are similar, but not because they're perceptually similar, but it's the relationships between the bird and the chick, and the relationships between the adult and the baby that are shared across both of these examples. So, and this underpins all of our verbal analogies. So there's lots of, underneath, it's understanding that things are similar because of this relational structure. And this ability to understand things as analogous or relationally similar provides a really powerful mechanism for building new concepts. So the best way to understand that is to just flesh out a couple of principles about how we think knowledge is represented in the mind and the way it works. And then we can understand how analogy is implicated in changing knowledge as we learn. So I should point out at this point that how knowledge is represented in the mind is a hotly debated topic, and different theories have different explanations of this. So what I'm going to describe here is a model, a set of principles that are useful for learning about, or for understanding how analogy works in learning, and understanding how we can use that in the classroom. So one way to think about how knowledge is represented in the mind is as a network. So a network full of nodes and connections between nodes. And you can think of these nodes as things or objects or ideas. And these things have features, and there are connections between different objects and things. And these represent relations. So let me give you an example. So we might have, well, here's a thing, it's a bird, and it has these features, these intrinsic features, such as it's got wings, feathers, eyes, feet, beak. It's got brown, it's got different colored feathers, such as brown, white, and yellow. And then it has spatial relations with other things as well. So it flies through the air. It's spatially related to the environment, and it flies through the air. Worms go inside of it. They go inside its beak and it eats them. And eggs come out of it. It's consumed itself by larger animals. So we can think of these as the way it's spatial relations with the environment and other objects around it. And then we have causal relations as well. So it doesn't just, when it flies through the air, it actually causes the air to move itself. When it's consumed by another animal, it provides energy to that animal. It doesn't just come out of the egg, it cracks the egg open itself, it causes the egg to open itself. And it has a causal relationship with the food that it eats, in that the food provides energy to it. So a useful way to think about knowledge in this framework is that the meaning is conferred by how things relate to each other. And this is the kind of knowledge that children are learning about in school in all kinds of different domains, whether it's in science and they're learning about how different systems and objects relate to each other, such as plants or magnetism, or whether it's in English, where you're learning about how different grammatical categories relate to each other. The second point to make about knowledge, and this is going to be more important for later on, but it's worth saying now, is that our knowledge is only ever partially represented, and it's context specific. So if you think about the sentence, I'll see you in school tomorrow, and then think about the concept of school and how rich that schema, how rich all of the information that is associated to that word could be. Even if you're not a teacher or education researcher, you spent a significant proportion of your life in school, and all of those experiences are related to that word. So when we hear the sentence, I'll see you in school tomorrow, we don't want all of that information to become active. It would make no sense, it'd be very confusing. And the way that the brain works is it just chooses the bit that's relevant to that sentence. So in this, it might just be, I'll see you in school tomorrow, I'll see you in that spatial location, or where we're both standing now. And this allows us to just be quite frugal with our knowledge. We just choose the bits that's relevant to a task in hand. So for example, here's a schema of a battery. It's got intrinsic features, it's cylindrical, it's metallic, it's got these spatial relations on the top right. It comes in packaging, it's found in shops, it's carried in hands. And then it has these causal relationships as well. It supplies energy to electrical devices, it causes the thing to function itself. So if I was sitting at home, my TV remote stopped working, all I really need to know is that batteries supply energy to the TV remote. And that will allow me to infer that that's why the TV remote might not be working anymore. I might go over to my kitchen drawer then to see if I've got any batteries in the kitchen drawer. And then I need to know what it looks like. It's metallic and cylindrical, so I can spot batteries when I see them. If there's none in the kitchen drawer, then I need to know that they're found in shops. I might need to know that when I'm disposing of them, that they store energy and chemicals, and this can be toxic to the environment. And so this allows a great deal of flexibility with our knowledge and frugality in our cognitive processing. We only ever represent tiny bits of knowledge at a time. This is called partial representation. And this will become important later on when we're thinking about why children find analogies difficult. And so the last point to make about knowledge is that when we're learning, we're not learning new structures in isolation from everything else. We're not learning new schemas or new categories like clouds in the air that are separate from the ground. We're actually reconstructing existing knowledge structures, adapting them, recombining them in different ways, joining them together to form new categories, new knowledge. So if you think about our knowledge of the concepts such as democracy, democracy is quite a complex concept. You probably wouldn't learn later on in school, but you would learn things like participatory voting. You might be as a child in a classroom, a teacher might ask you to vote about what task you want to do next, or you might learn about leadership and governance through being in a school. And we can use that knowledge to build later on a more complex concept of democracy itself. So yeah, this is just a kind of schematic of that. So we can take relations and features from one body of knowledge and we can transfer them over and use them to understand something new that we're learning. So just to briefly go over that, the main points I made there was that knowledge can be thought of as represented in these networks of nodes and relationships between nodes, which broadly map onto kind of things in the world and the relationships between them. And the meaning in our knowledge is very relational. It's about how things relate to each other, how objects spatially relate to each other and causally relate to each other. The next thing I described was that we only ever represent a bit of this knowledge at a time, and that's dependent often on context. And the last point was knowledge is built from existing knowledge. So why this is important to kind of foreground the rest of the discussion is that analogy, this mechanism of analogy, understanding that things are relationally similar, provides two really important mechanisms in the way that we reconstruct knowledge in different ways. So moving on to the role of analogy in forming categories. So the first way is that we use analogies to group information together and form categories. So just to remind you that when we're comprehending an analogy, what we're understanding is that things are relationally similar to each other. Not that they're perceptually similar, it's that the relationship between the bird and the chick is the same as the relationship between the adult and the child. And when we can understand that things are relationally similar, we can start grouping them together to form categories and abstract away the shared relations and get rid of all the perceptual features and form these abstract categories. So I'll give you a couple of examples of this. So when I was in my kitchen recently, I accidentally stumbled across a new category that I'd never seen before. And I put these two vessels down on the counter and noticed that, oh, they're kind of similar. They're analogous to each other. They've both got three objects that are floating in some liquid, and the liquid is contained by some kind of glass vessel. And we could call this a category. We could give this a name if we wanted to. So let's call it a DAX. And now that I've kind of understood how these are relationally similar, they both have these same spatial relational structures, three things floating in water or a liquid, which is contained by a vessel. Once I've given it a label, I can start adding new labels to it as well. So understanding that these are analogous is like the genesis of a category. And then I can use language to consolidate that, give it a new perceptual form, and then use that language to kind of cue the shared relations across both of these examples. And I can add new categories. So I could say, well, one of these is also a DAX. And then you can add more and more categories, more and more members into these kind of categories. Now that's kind of not a very useful category. That's probably why we don't have a name for this kind of thing. It doesn't give much use to us. However, this is a useful spatial category. So numbers, in this case, this is the concept of 8, also refer to spatial relations between things. And so numbers are a really nice example of analogy at play. So all of these constructions that this child is playing with on their table are all analogous to each other. They're all spatially analogous. And then we can give that a word, a perceptual form, in this case 8. And then we can use that and categorize other things as 8 as well, in the same way that we categorized those vessels as a DAX before. So that's one way in which we can form categories through analogy, by noticing the spatial relations between things and then giving them a word and then consolidating that as a category. And we can also do this through conceptual information as well. So if we think about some of the knowledge we might have for a bank account, for example. So there's 2 things here. This is my kind of schema. We've got a bank account balance and then the interest earned. And these have relations to each other as well. We might know that the more money I have in my bank account, this causes more interest to be earned. So it's got a causal relationship with it. And I might also know that if I earn more interest in my bank account, then this causes the bank account balance to increase. And this is a really interesting relational structure, in that both of the bank account balance and interest earned are both causes and effects. One causes the other, and an effect happens, and that effect causes another effect in the bank account balance. So we can compare that with another analogous example. So in geography, you might learn about the population size of a country. You might learn that the size of a population is related to the number of births that take place, or influences the number of births that take place in a country as well. So the greater the size of the population in a country, this causes increases in the number of births. As more people, more children are born. And the more children that are born, this causes an increase in the population size in the country. So both of these knowledge structures are from completely different domains. One is about finance and mechanisms of banks, and the other is about population geography. But they share an analogous structure. They both share the structure that A, or one object or one thing, causes a change in B, and this causes a change in A. And we can give this by noticing the similarity across both of these. We can extract these abstract relationships and away from their perceptual or concrete features. And in the same way as we gave words to the spatial categories before, we can give this a new word. We can call this a positive feedback loop. And we can add more examples to our category of positive feedback loop. So perhaps whenever you kind of hear a screeching sound from a PA system and the microphone is too close to it, this is also a positive feedback loop, where the microphone or the speaker is causing vibrations to take place in the microphone, and that's causing it to come out of the speaker, and you get this positive feedback loop again. And so this is a really important way that we use analogy to reconstruct our existing knowledge into new forms, by comparing different analogous examples and extracting away the shared relations or relational structure, giving it some new linguistic form, and consolidating it in a category. So this is the first principle, that the mind forms categories by grouping analogous things together and then extracting their shared relational structure. And what does that mean for us teaching? Well, we can extend, if that's what's taking place in the mind, if the mind is trying to group stuff together and extract these shared relations, then providing children with the opportunity to compare different examples of the same category can support them in learning this category. So just to go back to this DAX example, or these this new category on the left-hand side, I'm fairly sure that I've probably had experience of 3 things floating in liquid in a vessel before, and perhaps you have as well. However, I've never noticed how they're analogous to each other or similar to each other. But when they're spatially together in the same context, then you have the opportunity to compare across both of them. And then it makes it much easier to understand how they're analogous and then group them together in categories. So providing children with different opportunities to compare different members of the same category allows them to kind of extract what's similar across both of them and form these new categories. So what kind of categories, relational categories, do children learn? Well, much of the work in this area has been on science and mathematics, and that's because these are very abstract domains of knowledge. In science, you're often learning about things you can't see, structures that are invisible or hidden mechanisms. And mathematics is a highly abstract spatial domain. But in principle, there's no reason why this shouldn't work or this couldn't work for all kinds of domains of knowledge that we teach in schools. So, for example, in English, grammatical categories of words are relational categories. A verb gets its meaning from how it relates to agents and objects and actions. The structure of a sentence, the subject, verb, object, is a relational structure itself. And stories have different structures as well. They have different relational categories, such as protagonist or antagonist, and different kind of event structures that take place. In mathematics, numbers are relational categories. Fractions, algebraic equations, these are all relational categories. In geography, you might be learning about maps or different geographic regions. Again, these are all systems of relations. In history, you might be learning about monarchs and how they relate to certain countries, or different types of events such as wars and revolutions. These are all defined by different objects or different things and their relationships between each other. And in science, you might learn about life cycles, atoms, biological cells, lots of different things. So how can we compare? What's a useful way to kind of compare these different members of a different concept you might be teaching? Well, a useful way to think about it is the different kind of representations that we might use in when we're teaching. So using diagrams of a concept. So you might teach about a biological cell by showing a diagram of it, showing its cell wall, showing the different organelles that are spatially inside it, and describing those causal relations between different organelles and the function of the cell itself. So the kind of one of the key take-homes here really is providing 2 examples allows children to understand what's shared across both of them, rather than it just be tethered to one kind of concept, one representation. Providing different examples of equations and showing how they're similar and how they're different, and the different components and the different functions of the different operators and numbers allows children to compare across different examples and understand the similarities and differences and extract these deeper relational structures. In text, you might compare different essays and stories that share the same sentence structure. You might have them on the board or give children examples of them. And concept maps is another really useful way to provide ways for children to compare. So a lot of these things are what teachers do anyway. When you're learning mathematics, you're often comparing or given different examples of the same category, the same kind of sum or problem or equation to work through. And by definition, that's kind of comparing them. And so later on, we'll talk about a couple of different ways that make it easier or more difficult for children to compare these kind of different things. So concept maps, the last point here I made here was concept maps are really useful for providing a graphical illustration of the things the important elements in a concept and the relationships between them, particularly if you can't see them or if they're really vast and you can't just look at diagrams. And the graphic designer, Oliver Caviglio, has produced this very nice resource of different ways that you can graphically represent objects and the relationships between them. So check out and go and have a look at this. It's really useful. So on the left-hand side, you might have a graphical representation of a particular event in history, maybe a particular war. On the right-hand side, you might have another graphical representation, and that allows children to compare across both of these different representations. Another function of comparison is that it allows you to divide existing concepts into separate concepts as well. So you might have learned about a plant cell or cells, and cells have different features. They've got a particular relational structure. They have a cell wall, they have a nucleus, and they have different organelles that provide different functions within the actual cell itself. And by comparing different examples, you can divide these categories into subcategories and notice the differences. So by comparing them and pointing out that plant cells have different kind of organelles, they have chloroplasts in them, you can kind of start segmenting these concepts into more fine-grained, more detailed subcategories. You might compare different kind of story structures, highlighting the differences between them, showing how these different stories have beginnings and ends, and the relationships between the different points in the story are different across, and subdividing this category of story into different types of story, and so on. And so the first broad take home here is that providing children with opportunity to compare different examples of the same category, rather than just teaching it with one example, or examples of different categories, allows them to group categories together and segment them into more refined categories as well. And at the end, we'll talk a little bit about different ways that this can be done. So the next role of analogy in learning is that we can transfer information from one category to another. So what we just talked about there is grouping schemas together and forming these relational categories and dividing them into different categories. The next role of analogy is that once we can understand how things are analogous to each other, we can actually transfer conceptual information from one category to another category. And this is called transfer. This is something that's it's like the million-dollar question in education: how do you promote transfer? So they provide this way of using our existing knowledge to construct new knowledge. So, for example, if you were teaching about the history of the Earth, now it's very difficult to understand the kind of timescales that are involved in the different events that take place in the history of the Earth. We don't have any experience of that. Children don't have any experience of that. However, they do have experience of timescales that are relevant to their lives, such as the cycle of a day. And if you were teaching about the history of the Earth, you could use this as a way of borrow kind of different the temporal structure of a day, and then use that to understand the history of the Earth. So you might use analogies such as if the history of the Earth were compressed into 24 hours, starting at midnight, then the dinosaurs didn't appear until about 10:45 in the evening and were wiped out by 11:40. Humans didn't appear until 11:59 and 58 seconds. That's 2 seconds before midnight. And the Europeans didn't settle in North America until 1/10 of a second before midnight. So by using some familiar knowledge, something that children are very familiar with, we can, and adults, we can use that as a conceptual scaffold and plug new information into it to build a new knowledge structure. And in this case, the history of the Earth. this was some analogies, some really lovely analogies I saw in Spinney School, which is a primary school in Cambridge. And these primary children are learning about the structure and function of the brain. So, and in particular, they're learning about these two structures here. So one is the amygdala and one is the prefrontal cortex. So the amygdala is like the, it's the kind of a threat detector in the brain. It functions to kind of keep us up, make us scared when things are dangerous. It's like the heart of darkness of the brain. So if we get close to fire, it starts making us scared. It's there to keep us out of danger. And then the prefrontal cortex is where lots of the control structures reside. It's very involved in controlling different parts of the brain. And one of the things that it controls or attenuates is our emotional state, how scared we're feeling. And so as we get older, as we develop, the prefrontal cortex becomes, starts learning how to regulate the amygdala. So we no longer kind of cry when we fall over, and we can tell ourselves different things to cognitively regulate ourselves. And the children in this school were learning about this particular network in the school. But that's pretty easy for us to understand because we have some concepts to do with the brain and lots of experience in emotional regulation. But children don't, young children don't. And so these children were learning about the amygdala as the guard dog. And it wants to keep you safe, but it's very kind of emotionally reactive. It's going to shout quite a bit. But the prefrontal cortex is like the wise owl, and the wise owl can talk through the situation with the guard dog and calm it down. And so these children who were learning about neuroscience essentially, but learning it through concepts that they understood well, which is the story concept of the wise owl and a guard dog. And these kind of, this kind of analogical transfer is really useful for when we're learning about things that we can't see. So it's very useful in science, for example, and often used in history and all kinds of different domains as well. And so it looks a bit like this in our model of the network. So if we take the analogy, mitochondria are like the batteries of a cell. So if we're learning about mitochondria are a particular organelle within a cell, and you can learn about the function of mitochondria in relation to the actual cell with the analogy, they're like the batteries of the cell. And so in our model of knowledge, we've got, we might have a schema of a battery and its relationships to an electrical device, the remote control here. And we might know that it causes the electrical device to function and it supplies energy and it goes inside. And by forming an analogy with mitochondria and a cell, and in this case, the analogy, first of all, is that they're spatially related. So batteries go inside remote controls, and mitochondria go inside biological cells. And once we form that kind of spatial analogy, we can sort of just move things across, and we can learn that we can take these relations here, supplies energy, and transfer them over and use this to build our understanding of the functional role of mitochondria in a biological cell. And this is what transfer looks like in this model. It's taking parts of knowledge related to another concept and then transferring them over to build a new concept, to understand the causal relations in another concept as well. And so these three mechanisms, we've got these two mechanisms. One is by comparing different representations, we can form categories, form relational categories, and divide them into subcategories as well. And then we can use explicit analogies to transfer information from one domain to another. And both of these are really important mechanisms in how we reconstruct our existing knowledge into new kind of knowledge as well. So I'm just going to talk a little bit now about ways to support children in analogical learning. And a useful thing to think about, first of all, is why do children find analogies difficult? So what's required to understand the analogy mitochondria are like the batteries of a cell? Well, you need to understand that batteries supply energy to electrical devices. So you need to have the knowledge, first of all. And more than that, you need to attend to the correct relations. So you need to be thinking about, when you hear the analogy mitochondria like the batteries of the cell, you need to be thinking about that it supplies energy and that it causes the thing to function. You don't need to be thinking about that it comes in packaging or it's cylindrical. And that takes cognitive control, that takes attention. And the other thing you need to be thinking about is you need to hold those relations in mind to transfer them to the new context. You need to be thinking of that batteries cause remote controls to function, keep that in mind, and then use that in this new context. And that involves something called working memory. So the kind of information that we are able to keep in our mind at one point, keep in our mind and use it in a different context. And so this provides two useful ways to think about why children find analogies difficult, and also why it's important to think about development, because children's cognitive control and their working memory have a very protracted developmental trajectory. One of the longest developmental trajectories, in that it's still developing in adolescence and in early adulthood as well. And children of the same age as well can have different levels of cognitive control and different level working memory skills. And so if you don't hold on to this relation, perhaps you've represented that in hearing that analogy, you've represented that all batteries are metal. What can happen is you can end up transferring the wrong information across. And this can cause misconceptions. So analogies are sometimes described as a double-edged sword, in that they provide these very powerful mechanisms for learning, but then they also, if not handled correctly, can be the source of misconceptions as well. So understanding analogies, it involves understanding you need the required knowledge. You need to be able to attend to these different relations and different features in knowledge, because knowledge is context specific. It's only ever partially represented, and you need to be able to hold that. And those kind of three requirements are useful to think about in terms of how to support children. So if we're going to support children using analogies and thinking about their knowledge, the first thing is to make sure that any analogy is familiar to them. And I'm going to use an analogy shortly that may be unfamiliar to some, so that might highlight that. Supporting cognitive control requires scaffolding their attention. So compensating for their developing attentional skills by altering the kind of stimuli that you're presenting to them and the way that it's being presented. And we'll talk through a few different methods for that shortly. And the last one, supporting working memory. Well, an easy way to support working memory is to take away the requirement for children to have to hold it in working memory. So providing visual examples simultaneously, whether that's graphical examples on the board, whether it's different sentences, whether it's different story structures that they can see in front of them, that kind of negates the requirement for children to hold things in their actual working memory as well. So just going to go through a few different ways of supporting cognitive control, which I'm kind of going to group together in this idea of attentional scaffolding. So, and I'm going to use, I've got a couple of science examples here. So in the UK, there's quite a popular snack that you can buy called a Scotch egg. And a Scotch egg is a really good analogy for the internal structure of the earth. So a Scotch egg is an egg, and it's covered in sausage meat, and it's then covered in breadcrumbs, And when you slice it in half, it reveals this beautiful kind of internal structure. Now, if I just said, oh, the internal structure of Earth is a bit like a Scotch egg, and you didn't have the kind of cultural background where Scotch eggs were kind of everywhere or in most shops that you went to, that's a really good example of not being able to get the analogy. So when what we want to do when using analogies is to, in these kind of explicit ways, is to focus children's attention on these relations. So if they're not very good, or if the cognitive control is still developing, there are different ways that we can focus their attention on these kind of relations that we want them to transfer. So first of those is using relationally rich language. So if I want them to focus on the spatial structure of a Scotch egg, I can use, that's all I want to talk about when I'm describing it. So I could use very relationally rich language and get rid of all of the perceptual stuff. So I might say, like, look at the internal structure of this. So it's inside, there's a core in the center, and it's got 3 layers outside the core, and each is bigger. They surround each other, and it's got a thin crust on the outside. So by using this language, I'm cueing children's attention towards the relations that are going to be important for them to transfer across. And you can also use gestures. Gestures are a really important part of the way we communicate. And often it's not, we don't really, we're not explicitly aware of them all the time. But even though we're not explicitly aware of them, our mind is taking the information that is communicated in gestures and adding that to this kind of mix when we're kind of building a mental model. So you can notice it when there's a conflict, for example. So if I said, perhaps Zoom is not a great place to do gestures, but if I said, oh, it's tiny, it's really small, you immediately notice the conflict between the information that is being communicated in my language and the information that's being communicated in the gestures that I'm using. But we can use gestures to highlight different relations as well. So I could say that there's a core in the inside, and around this core there are different layers, and they surround each other. And there's the core, and then another layer, and then another layer, and there's a very thin crust on the outside. So by using relationally rich language and by using these gestures, you can focus children's attention on the kind of information that you want them to transfer across. Oh, yeah, I just talked about that. Using kind of pointing out and highlighting the differences and similarities as you're explaining these analogies is really useful to guide their attention. So when I'm talking about the core, I say, look, there's a core here in this Scotch egg. It's got these 3 layers. It's got this crust on the outside. Now, I want you to look over here. Have a look over here. You see how there's a core in the Scotch egg, and it's kind of the same as the core in the earth. And so literally using your hands to sort of guide their attention and scaffold their cognitive control is a really useful way to kind of make sure that children are kind of thinking about what you want them to think about when you're using kind of these explicit forms of analogies. Another way that you can use analogy, you can scaffold children's attention, is to use, sorry, just trying to get rid of the thing that's at the top of my screen because I can't see. So I'm going to assume that says color because I can't actually see it. By using color, using perceptual features. So perceptual features are very salient to children, very salient to adults as well, but they're more salient to children when their knowledge, their relational knowledge is perhaps newer and not as strong. But we can use that to guide their attention. So in this example, which is from this really good paper, Teaching by Analogy, From Theory to Practice, a visual representation is presented about a kitchen and the different items you might find in a kitchen. and the functions that they have. So we've got, kitchen's got this kitchen wall around the outside of it. It's got a generator in it that supplies energy. It's got a recipe book. There's a garbage disposal unit, and there's different areas for preparation and placing and packing. And by using this analogy and providing this simultaneously with where we want to transfer it to, this representation of a cell, and by using colors to highlight things that have the same relational structure or the same functional role, this helps children guide their attention. So you might say that the recipe, the mitochondria, or the generator here, provides energy to the kitchen. It's green, and then that's the same as the mitochondria in a cell. These also provide energy to the cell. Another way to do this is to use spatial alignment. So if you notice that the objects in these different representations are the same color when they have the same relational role, but they're also in the same spatial position. So the generator and the mitochondria at the bottom, the food preparation and the ribosomes are on the left-hand side. And this is just making it easier for children to see where similarity is across both of these representations. They don't need to exert any search strategies or think about moving their attention around in different ways. It's just kind of scaffolding their attention. And so this was a kind of brief overview of a kind of some sort of kind of theory that's hopefully useful in the classroom. And so just to kind of summarize all this up, so analogy allows us to form new categories and transfer knowledge between categories. By understanding that things are relationally similar, we can group them together and use language to form new abstract categories. And then we can also transfer knowledge between them. And this is a really fundamental way in which the mind learns. And children are learning by this. They're learning using these analogies and implicit analogies, whether we're using explicit analogies or not. And that means that we can extend that into classroom practice by providing children opportunities to compare examples from categories. This is going to support learning. It supports learning by forming new categories and dividing categories into subcategories as well. And there's, like I said earlier, much of the work in this area has been in science and in mathematics, and I've got a few examples for further reading at the end of this presentation. But in principle, there's no reason why you can't try this with any kind of category that's relational, whether it's the sentence structure or different concepts you might find in geography, such as maps and monarchs, or different mathematical equations and so on. And then explicit analogies provides a way to use our existing knowledge in the construction of new knowledge. So the last point I'm going to make is just to kind of sum up these different strategies. So supporting, how to support children when learning with analogies. So first of all, it's really important analogies that are familiar to children, analogies that they understand. Otherwise, it can be very difficult for them to take that information and then use it in a different kind of context. Providing simultaneous examples for them to compare negates they don't have to hold it in their working memory anymore. So you're kind of making it easier for them to kind of just look back and forth and see where these similarities and differences are. And scaffolding attention can be really useful to highlight these relevant relations. So using relational language, using gestures, using spatial alignment when roles, things have similar relational roles, and using colors to highlight these shared roles and relations as well. And a really important thing that I didn't mention is discussing where analogies break down. So discussing that, the way that the Earth, the internal structure of the Earth is not like an egg, is that it's not made of the same stuff. It's not made of the same substance. It's not the same colors. It's just the spatial structure that we want to be focusing on, asking questions to kind of probe children's understanding and making sure they're not forming misconceptions. So I've just put a couple of references here that are really useful for kind of going through all of those strategies that I've just kind of mentioned, really. So the first two are a bit more teacher focused, so and provide lots of useful strategies for using in a classroom. And the last one is a bit more psychological focused and goes into the cognitive mechanisms a little bit more. But thank you very much for listening, and that's look forward to any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was really interesting stuff. And I have to say, I was quite excited at the use of the Scotch egg as, as an analogy. I'm quite intrigued by that. There are a couple of questions in the chat, and then we can just open it up to whoever would like to jump in. Please feel feel free to put things into the chat or to raise your hand and I will find you. Okay. So the first one is from Bev, who says, why are dyslexics good at coming up with analogies? I'm
not sure. I'm sorry. I wasn't aware. I didn't know that was a particular finding in the research, but yeah, I don't know about that, I'm afraid. So I don't know. Is there a particular paper that you're thinking of, Bev, or is there some examples maybe? Maybe you can put it in the chat after.
Okay, well, maybe Bev can get back to us with some resources for that, because that'd be quite interesting to hear about.
Yeah,
Paul says, thanks for the interesting talk. Those who have significant difficulty with maths is called dyscalculia. Is there an equivalent for understanding analogies?
Well, that's a really interesting question. Is there, there's not there isn't a developmental disorder or that would describe that refers to a difficulty with analogies per se, but there are lots of ways that analogies can be difficult, because if you have poor attention, you might find particular analogies difficult because you have to kind of search around and find those abstract relations. Or if you have difficulty holding information in working memory, these might make analogies more difficult. So there isn't a particular a specific deficit or difficulty that you might have with analogies, but there is it all depends on lots of different factors. So like when we understand an analogy such as mitochondria, like the batteries of the cell, and this kind of like magic trick happens, and we can understand that a cell, the functional role of mitochondria is that it supplies energy to the cell. That seems quite easy, but there's lots of different cognitive processes taking place. I've mentioned before, you've got to hold in working memory, you've got to understand the knowledge itself. But you need to understand language, you need to understand the communicative intent of the person who's saying that. So it's quite a complex operation that's sort of hidden behind that cognitive magic trick. And anything, if you have kind of difficulties or you struggle in different kind of cognitive ways, that can impact on your understanding of analogies. But there's nothing, all children can understand analogies. It's just the amount of scaffolding that's needed changes, and how the kind of distance in the analogies that they might be able to form as well. So I hope that answers your question, Paul.
I mean, there's definitely going to be a developmental trajectory there, isn't there? Because sort of like map reading or understanding how things stand for other things, right? That you need to be able to understand that even is something that could work, that you can actually match stuff that doesn't seem to be directly related onto each other. Vicky says, I'm autistic and I've worked with children and adults who are also autistic. Have you noticed that the use of analogies is higher in this population? I think you sort of basically went into that by saying you didn't know much about whether or not there was some links to neurodivergence, but
well, so there is actually work in analogy and autism, but I think I think it's hard to pull out very firm conclusions from it at the moment. I think it's one of those things where I think people at one time thought that analogies and metaphors might be more difficult if you have autism or for people with autism, but I think the kind of research is actually moving in the other direction now and saying that that might not be the case, but it's a really interesting question. But I haven't noticed myself. Thank you.
You're getting lots of really interesting questions. People are clearly intrigued by how to use this. Joe says, I thank you for the talk. I'm curious how experts use analogies. Is there a progression of learning through analogies, for example, that one gets better at using analogies?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because you could think of some people seem to be quite creative. They just seem to be quite creative people, and they're generally really good at forming analogies. And the progression of learning with analogies is more the research. Much of the research has been on the development of children's ability to learn analogies. But in terms of how experts use them themselves, maybe there's, I'm not sure, I know there might be some other people in the audience who have a better understanding of that, but I'm not too sure if experts use them differently. But expertise is domain specific for a start. So if you have knowledge in a particular area, you might be better at forming analogies in that area or across with another area. But in terms of using them differently, that's an interesting question. Yeah. So there's a lot of that's an interesting question, and I'm not sure, but
Oh, Bev did say that to look at Geschwind on dyslexia. The idea being, if you can't do words, you use your vision. The famous benzene ring. So I'm actually very interested in this because I do a lot of work with thinking about dyslexia. So I'm going to have a look into that. I think we have time for a couple more. So is there a connection between analogical reasoning and first principle thinking? Alexandra asks.
Yeah. Do you possibly? Yeah, I'm not. So first principle thinking to me is understanding a particular domain quite well, so you know the kind of principles, and then using those principles to
Sort of breaking it down, isn't it?
Yeah, think about a problem in an alternative way that might have been solved in a different way before. So sort of going back to, so that's a really, yeah. I'm very sorry, I'm not entirely sure. But did you have a particular way that you thought that might be the case? I'd be interested to hear what you think on that, or what the audience members. But
yeah, I think it might be easier to say it out loud rather than kind of write it down. The idea that I have of first principle thinking is basically in order to understand a concept, you have to kind of break it down into its fundamental elements. More often than not, you have to go to a higher level of abstraction in order to understand the inner functioning or the inner mechanism or the inner characteristics of something, so that you can extract some kind of an abstract map that explains how things unfold. And when you talked, for instance, about the Scotch and the Earth, it kind of breaks it down into the idea of these overlapping structures, circle within a circle within a circle. So the abstract way of looking at it is that there are these series of circles within circles within circles that kind of overlap. So I was just curious to see if there's any kind of proof or research or evidence or thoughts or hypotheses where these kind of two elements are connected to one another. I mean, these two thinking patterns are connected to one another.
So my kind of speculative thoughts on that are that analogies are fundamental for learning these kind of abstract relational concepts. And if you need those abstract relational concepts for this description of first principles thinking, then they are related. But in the same way that analogy is also related to learning the syntax of language or learning, it's kind of some researchers have described it as the core of cognition, and admittedly these are analogy researchers, but they say, but there is a good reason for that, in that it's thought to be really crucial for abstracting away principles and relations from concrete experience and concrete categories. And so in that sense, it would definitely be involved in the kind of first principles thinking, if that makes sense.
It kind of does, but it's very blurry. I mean, which part of it is analogical then, and which part of it is first principle thinking?
Well, the way I understood your description of first principles thinking was in that that it's understanding these internal principles of a process.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that in order to do that, you need to have abstract categories and to have abstract relational concepts, and that analogy is important for forming those relational concepts. But I don't see them as fundamentally different to the kind of concepts that you might use, qualitatively different might be a better term, to the kind of concepts you might use to understand the mechanisms of an atom, or any kind of hidden causal mechanism. But I'm not sure on that. So yeah, it'd be interesting to think about that more, definitely.
It's just gone past 5, so I guess it's time for us to say thank you to Matt for a really interesting talk that clearly engaged a lot of people. And thank you for the discussion, and for everyone who put their questions in. It was really terrific. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Thanks, Natasha.